welcome back to another episode of Masked Monologues. Today I have with me Jenny. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us about what it is you do.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, AKA girl. I'm really enjoying Masked Monologues podcast and your focus on highlighting creatives. My name is Jenny Leigh Hodgins. I'm the host of Your Creative Chord and Your Creative Chord podcast, where I help people tap into their creativity and potential through my podcast, my books, and my courses. And I offer reflective prompts, engaging discussions, practical guidance, and I'm hoping to inspire personal growth and transformation, fostering a supportive creative community. I'm a musician, a poet, former music piano chorus teacher, and writer, author. I have a couple books coming out soon. So thank you for having me.
No, that's wonderful. It really seems like you've delved into everything, explored both poetry and music. Can you tell me how it all started?
Oh my goodness, that was a long time ago. Maybe I'll focus, since I have so many different things. I do music composition. I've composed for indie films. I've done lots of piano specific solo music, contemporary and classical kind of combination. I've put together a musical theater CD when I lived in Japan for 5 years ago. And I've recently released a new poetry and lyrics collection called Kaleidoscope of the Heart, which is what I'd really like to talk about more today. And I'm a hobbyist nature photographer, and I weave those photos that I take into my designs and things for Your Creative Chord. And I rebooted Your Creative Chord podcast after a bit of a gap.
Mhm.
So I'm right in the middle of a poetry series there. I just featured another podcaster, poet, caregiver, writer, author extraordinaire, and I'm delving into some episodes that are specific to my book that just is about to launch on June 4, called Kaleidoscope of the Heart. So focusing on lyrics and poetry right now.
Yes, and I'm always curious when I hear people who do both music and poetry to know which one came first, because for me, it started with a mix, actually. The more I think about it now, it's like they came together in an odd sense. And I'm just wondering how that
Interesting.
worked out for you. Was it you started with the piano and then you thought, hey, maybe I should start writing my own lyrics to it, and then that morphed into poetry, or how did it begin for
Yeah,
you?
all over the place. Different things. When I just write words and I'm not thinking about music, my process is just to really, it starts as a way of directly dealing with and processing my experiences, my real life experiences and
Mhm,
my feelings, and I just translate those into words. And when I'm just writing words or lyrics, sometimes I'll do the lyrics without the music. I often start with a particular feeling or an event, and I just let my words flow naturally, and I shape them into verses that convey how I feel in that
mhm.
moment or my perspective of that. And as I'm writing that, often it helps me shift my feelings and the ultimate outcome or the meaning of the verse. And
Yes.
sometimes I'll focus on rhyme when I'm writing words. And sometimes when I do that, not always, I'm thinking musically.
Mhm,
And I would say the majority of the songwriting that I've done, not necessarily things without lyrics, but when I'm doing songwriting, I focus on a clear structure to work within,
mhm.
a clear meter,
Yes.
and I'm focusing on the rhymes themselves.
Mm,
And basically try to stick to that form. And then
mhm,
if I'm thinking that I want to make it into a song, to answer your question bluntly, at 90% of the time I write lyrics first. And
mhm.
then it morphs into, okay, if I'm going to write lyrics first and I'm sticking with the structure in a rhyme, then I try to kind of imagine verse, chorus, and maybe a bridge in there. And I give myself that limitation first, a structure first. And then I hold myself accountable to staying in there and rhyming things accordingly. And then I'll work on the music with that. I don't always do it that way. There have been times where I've just simply sat at the piano and improvised or fiddled around with chords, and a melody comes to me, and then I'll compose the melody first. Usually I write it down so I don't forget it with notation, pencil and
Yes.
paper to it, old style. And then I'll come back and put words to it. But most of the time, words come first for me in terms of songwriting.
And I definitely would love to touch on the difference between poetry and lyrics, because I've
Mm,
noticed that a lot of poets and a lot of lyricists or songwriters, although there's commonalities,
mhm,
lyricists and musicians obviously have to pay more attention to that meter. And when you're writing a song, you have to take out a couple of words, remix it around, put in this word because it doesn't fit the meter, and it can be the most annoying process if you want to convey a certain message and you're like, but I like it this way, but it doesn't fit the meter. And
Yeah.
so it's just the difference between poetry and lyrics, because poetry, you have more freedom where you don't have to be that strict as in regards to the meter. But no,
Mm.
I love how you have both of those hats on, because you can turn it
Mhm.
into a song if you can leave it as a poem, put it in your poetry collection. And I'm wondering, did you have any mentors, any teachers when starting out with writing lyrics, writing poetry, even music?
That's a lot of that covered a lot of ground there. Okay, let me start with responding to writing and the limitation of songwriting versus, as you say, the less
Yes,
limits with writing poetry. I think that can be true with some types of poetry, but sometimes if I'm not writing music and I'm sticking to just writing the words and not thinking about the music, at least in the moment, I still have, some pretty clear structure and limitations. It depends on what kind of poetry form I'm using,
true.
or if I'm sticking to a particular rhyme scheme, and you can feel the rhythm and the flow and the meter and
Yes.
exactly how many syllables, for example, line by line. There's still a pretty good limit there with poetry itself. Though I agree with you that because some of my poetry is prose or free
Mhm.
flowing, some of it's epic, which is story like. And what you said definitely applies to those things. There are really very little limits in that sense, in terms of meter, structure,
Yeah.
fitting a word in, fitting an idea in that way. But I agree, it can be a real songwriting struggle when you're writing lyrics because you have a particular musical form and structure and rhythm, and you've got that box to fit into.
Yes.
Sometimes those words don't fit. I think there's some ways around that. And sometimes even the music itself can change, depends on where you are with your music writing, I guess, with that. But back to, I'm just shooting off the cuff from the top of my head in response
Yes.
to your question. But back to your question about influences, most of my influences were classical because I studied classical piano when I was a kid. And through my teens, I went to school and got a music degree in music composition. I started out as a piano performance major, and I switched to composition because this is not probably something I should share as a former piano teacher, but I would spend a whole lot more time writing and improvising my own music than I would practicing the classical pieces. So I ended up switching to composition, and I was also a vocal major and president of a lot of the choirs and stuff back then.
Yes.
So I have a very strong classical and musical theater influence, and I love musical theater. And then I didn't really listen to a lot of pop music as I was growing up, but I like clear, good vocalists, long story shorter, with a good, strong melody line. And I
Yes.
gravitate towards musical theater in general because
No.
of the lyrics, probably.
No, it's exceptional how a good vocalist makes all the difference when it comes to a recording.
Yes, and or just the what am I trying to say? The interpretation of the song itself, and
Yeah.
a good vocalist can make that take that meaning to a whole different level. And I will say for myself, even though I performed and gigged as a vocalist pianist for many years and taught piano and chorus and piano for many years, as in 25 and 30 years, I don't do that performance stuff anymore. And but I will say, even though I've sung, I have a CD with my voice
Mhm.
on it, I've done gigs with my voice on it. I never really thought of myself as a vocalist, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. I always felt like even though I've written songs, I've always felt like a really good vocalist could take that song to a whole nother level. I didn't never thought that I call myself a writer and a creator
Mhm.
first and foremost. So that's always been my identity. And I'm okay with being a pianist because piano is the way I express. But I being a vocalist, even with my own songs, I feel like somebody else could do it so much more justice. When you think about, and this is old school, but
Yeah.
I saw something on TV once. Dolly Parton was talking about her song, very old song called "I Will Always Love You." It's a beautiful song. I'm sure you're familiar with it as
I
a
am.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And yet
Whitney
she
Houston did it
yes,
better.
exactly. Yes, she was talking about how when Whitney Houston took that song, Dolly heard it on the radio for the first time, had to pull over because it was so incredibly moving what Whitney Houston, this incredible vocalist, did with her song. So
Yes.
that is an example of what I'm saying. I think someone else could do it. Not that Dolly Parton's version wasn't great. It is, but Whitney Houston just took it to a beyond the earth dimension with her skills as a vocalist. So I hope that I don't know if that answered the question. I just went all over the place.
I want to jump back to you saying that you used writing as a form or I guess an outlet to express yourself, your emotions. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you journal every day or if you spend 15, 20 minutes here and there writing down all your thoughts and then turn them into poetry, or how does your process work? Because every creative, every writer has a different process. Some people write when they're inspired, some people write every day, some people write, they have just one sole idea and they branch out a web from that and build on top of it and then turn it into a poem or into a story, whatever. So I'm just wondering how your process works.
All of the above. Yeah, I think for me, I'm much older, I think, than you are just judging from the tone of your voice and mine, the energy. But I think over the years, that process has shifted and changed. But so, for example, I do journal every single morning. Basically, it's not to capture poetry, but it's to express where I'm at in the moment and where I want to be the next moment, tallying my dreams, my goals, that kind of thing. But in terms of writing poetry and lyrics, often I guess I just have had a regular habit of taking time out to put myself in that seat. And even if I didn't feel inspired, whatever, sometimes it was very inspiring because it was an adversity or something moved me or a
Yes,
relationship or a friendship or whatever, or life itself. And I would just had a habit of going to the pen and paper or pencil and paper to write what was going on. I'll give you an example. And I think a lot of artists are this way. I always tended to feel things a lot more deeply, more sensitively than a lot of people around me. I noticed that
that is
non-artists or people.
contagious.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't really like to categorize non-artist and artist because I
Mhm.
do think we all have that in us. But it's a matter of artists that choose to walk the artist path seem to be more in touch with it. So for example, in a daily life scenario, came home one time and was opening the door to my then apartment and I saw a homeless person, and it blew me away with emotion. So I came inside and I just sat down and wrote my feelings about it, and that morphed into a poem, for example. Nature is another big inspiration for me.
Yes,
Just writing about what I see, what I feel. And in terms of songwriting, that's the same thing. Sometimes I had been given assignments by either I'm writing something for a short film or a community event or for my kids when I was teaching and I needed a good song for something, and I would sit down to try to accomplish that assignment, or I had to
yes,
play for someone's wedding and they wanted an original song, for example. So in those situations, when you're just thrown under the bus, put on the spot to conjure something, that's just how I would just sit down and write honestly. What do I think about it? What do I feel? Or I'd imagine a situation or a scenario and take some time to really think through it. I actually did a podcast episode on this recently on my podcast. It was about my creative exploration formula. And I go through that process of, for example, in that type of scenario, spend time using your senses to just imagine it and
mhm.
describe it. And then from there, from just the work of writing my ideas down, usually I'll get some kind of a creative spark and roll with it. I hope that answered that question.
Yes. No, it's so funny how when you start from a point of ability, once you start with something authentic, genuine, and raw, how much other people can relate to it, how much they can
Yes.
say, I've been in that situation, I've been there, I know exactly what your poem is speaking about, what your song is speaking about. And for me, and I believe for other creatives as well, it's capturing that idea and just finding the tools, finding the skills necessary to convey it in a way that not only makes sense to you, because as creatives, we can be selfish and think, you know what, I like this, it resonates with me, it's just for me, and nobody else gets it.
It's funny, you hit that idea very well. I feel like the more personally authentic and open and vulnerable our writing is, the more universally it's related to. It's so weird that I'm being very specific about my personal situation and feelings and circumstances, and yet the more specific I get in my writing, it is amazing how many more people universally can relate to that. I find that so ironic.
Yes.
Interesting.
It's a major songwriting tool or songwriting skill technique people tell you to use is don't just have this huge overarching picture, don't just have these vague sort of details,
Mhm.
go into specifics. Find that maybe it's a coat you wore, maybe it's a dress, maybe it's some shoes, maybe it's a flower, whatever it is, and then tie it into your writing because those small little aspects, you might overlook them because you might think, "Oh, that's just a given, isn't it?" But other
Mhm.
people will see that and say, "Hey, you know what? I have a scarf like that and it reminds me of this certain thing. It reminds
Yeah.
me of this time frame in my life, this event. Maybe it was trauma, maybe it was happy, whatever it
Mhm.
was." And just relate back to it. I love that. Do you have any other writing tips? Because you do both songwriting and poetry. So,
Mhm.
are there any techniques, any tools, maybe even exercises that you use to refine your craft?
That's great. Before I answer that, I want to piggyback on what you said. Good ideas there. You were talking about how the more specific ideas we write about with regard to our circumstances, even if we think they're irrelevant to a song, I think sometimes when we write that detail, what that does is open up even more vulnerability, more emotion. The more detailed we describe things, we actually can open up a deeper connection to that creative flow. So that's why I say, and one creative tip I would recommend is be who you are, be
Mhm.
vulnerable, say it like it is, say exactly how you feel, don't judge it, zero judgment. You can go back later and look at it and edit it with your little editor hat on, but in the moment, my main tip to anybody that wants to be creative is just open your heart and be who you are and let it flow and see where it takes you. The second tip I share often is once you start to do that, let your curiosity just lead you where it wants to go. Don't overthink it. Don't try to judge where does it need to go. Just let it go and follow that route as long as it'll take you somewhere. And I think I always suggest start with because we're all so hard on ourselves, except for children. We unless you've been through trauma and you're a child, but most adults are a lot harder on ourselves than kids are.
Mm.
So when you're trying to approach a creative activity or expression or a project, the first thing I would recommend, and I tell myself all of these things constantly, not just advising others, but let go of any judgment, let go of that inner critic, and just let your greater self express and let it say whatever it wants to say. And then use your curiosity, let it lead where you want it to go, and just spend some time there. And then later you can go back and look at it. And then that's where you can, I would also say, allow yourself to fail, quote unquote, because when we're writing, it's sometimes hard for anyone to separate their creative hat from their editor hat. So to me, the editor hat is always looking for what's wrong with it. Like, and so set that hat aside and just write it and be willing to let it fail miserably. I would even, one of the tips I've shared with people and I use it myself is sometimes when I'm blocked, I feel like no inspiration or I'm stuck at a project and I don't know how to start. I'll tell myself, just how can I express that? How can I explain that? When you're blocked with something, just let go of your editor hat. And in fact, I've sat down sometimes because I'm not a country artist and I've never
Yes.
really gravitated to country music. So no offense to any country music because that's a legitimate, valid style. And
Mhm.
but because I'm no good at it, I would often set myself a goal when I'm blocked or stuck for an idea to write the most ridiculous, horrible country song I can imagine. Just to make it, I call it make it stupid. Approach it with just this idea. I'm just going to make it stupid, forget all the rules, forget everything I know about how to do a good job with it, and just aim to be ridiculously stupid. And it's amazing to me that even when I approach writing something with this idea
Approach it
that it's
like
going
a
to be,
kid.
yes, and not just open-minded as a child, but purposely try to make something ridiculous that is not your best work. Like, just, I'm gonna do something silly that to me is no good or is completely out of my style. For example, like country is way out of my style.
Yes.
So when I set my mind to doing something that's very different and kind of embrace it's gonna suck, it's gonna be terrible. It's like me trying to write hip hop right now because I've not listened to hip hop and I've come from a classical training and my background's not I haven't had those influences. So if I sat down to do that, in my mind, it would be pathetic. But by doing that, by sitting down and giving ourselves a task that seems crazy stupid, what it does is it releases that inner critic. It takes away all the judgment and it gives you the freedom to just do whatever. And I find a lot of good ideas come from that lack of judgment area when I do that exercise. Make it stupid.
And it's so funny how being a creative is adopting a whole new mindset where I feel as though adults, they always want to be in control of everything. As an adult,
Yeah,
you want to steer the ship, you want to know where you're going, you want to just go from, you want to know your endpoint, get there, and not have anything in your way obstructing
right.
your goals. And when it comes to the creative process, you've got everything thrown at you and you have to
Right.
ride the waves. You've got to be malleable. You've got to be flexible. You've got to adjust to everything coming at you. And that's when you find optimal creativity, once you can optimize your work, because then you're giving in and you're just letting the product be what it needs to be, and then
Yeah,
maybe if it's not where you want it to be, start again, right? It's
right.
an endless process.
Revise it, maybe
Yes,
change it. Yeah.
yes. And I just want to know, with your poetry book, how did that come about? Did you start writing pages for this book on a specific theme, on a specific topic, or was it just a collection of poems?
That's such a good question. This is good conversation. It's going to inspire both of us when we get done. Okay, so the inspiration for my book is called Kaleidoscope of the Heart. It is a collection of poetry and lyrics that I have written over many years. And the verses in the book come from my own life experiences, my personal journey, and they're on different themes. My journey as an artist, my journey in love and relationships through significant losses that I've had, deaths of loved ones, in my efforts to process and transform periods of difficulties, adversity, and also it's on the topics of, you can see clearly a thread that I'm working on myself to develop a strong life state and a positive mindset. And the goal of my poetry and lyric writing, as I said earlier, is like just to sit with my feelings, first of all, and create meaning from what's going on in the situation. Is really just therapeutic, personal in many ways. It's at
Yes,
first. And then I am a practicing SGI Buddhist. I've practiced Buddhism for 37 years. So that philosophy and practice, which is basically about finding your better self and polishing it and then bringing it to the world to contribute positively and empower other people to see their own best self,
yes,
basically. So that kind of philosophy is a definite thread, even through the poems and lyrics that are about loss or difficulties or challenging relationships. It covers a lot of ground, from loss, romance, troubled relationships, self-doubt, adversity, nature. Nature's a big inspiration for me, friendship, and of course, personal struggles and personal victory. And we talked a little bit about already about how sometimes I would sit down and compose things. My creative process in all of these always starts with dealing directly with and processing what I'm experiencing and my emotions. Like we talked about, we're, as artists, we get blown away a lot emotionally. So we have to sit down and process it through. And it's a great way to create value from suffering or struggle, is to sit down and create something. So I've started with that, various things, a feeling or an event that's happened, and I just let my words flow naturally. And then I shape them into verses that convey how I feel in that moment. And then in this particular book, I have, over the years, I would, because for many years, I was a starving artist, as they say, and I
yes,
never had money to like gift people things, but I would always put collections of my lyrics or my poems together and give little, maybe 20 to 30 page chapbooks of my
yes.
verses to my friends and my family or whatever.
Mhm.
And I hadn't done that in many years. And I had the story behind this particular book, or the inspiration for it, is life has been very busy in different directions, and I haven't been writing lyrics or poetry for a while. And a particular friend of mine, excuse me, really encouraged me a lot in the past 7 years of a journey that I'm on right now, since I've moved back to my hometown to be a caregiver for my senior mother. And through her encouragement over these years, with many challenges that come with that journey, I decided I just wanted to do that for her. I thought, okay, I'll just put together a little chapbook and give her a nice little gift of my poems and lyrics. And as I got going into that project, I was like, oh my gosh, I have a lot of poetry. I have a lot of lyrics. Like, this could be like a bigger thing. This could be a bigger project that I could not only thank her, but make it into a project where I'm showing my work and treasuring my own creativity, my own work, basically. So that's the story behind it. And I really thank her, because not only was I trying to thank her, she yet again inspired me to do this
Yes.
project. And so I spent a grueling 4 months sorting through a lot of verses and then editing them. Like, it's amazing how much you can see improvement when you get away from it and come back to it later. So I edited them and then I sorted and organized them. That was the kind of the hard part of it, is trying to pick and choose what makes the cut, what's not so great, what do you want to leave for writing more, and then sorting them into those different kind of themes. And it was grueling because not only was I dealing with that, but I'm also, as I said, a caregiver. I'm running an online business as a solo entrepreneur,
Yeah.
and I'm a board president for our HOA. And we're going through a lot
You're
of
wearing a lot of hats.
lots of stuff. Yeah. So that's the story behind it.
Yes. No, thank you so much. I'd like to wrap up
Thank you.
this episode now. So if you'd like to shout out to your website, any social media platforms, I'm sure people would love to come and check out what you do, and where can they find you?
Oh, I really appreciate this so much, AKA girl. And I want to, before I
you.
give my, how people can contact me and connect with me, I want to say thank you for your podcast, because I've just recently discovered you. And it's really great because you really do highlight a plethora of different types of creators, from singers to poets to artists. And it's really wonderful. I've been listening to a lot of the things that you've already posted, and I just feel like I'm at home when I'm listening to all these different artists because we can really relate to each other and it's inspiring. So shout out, plug for Masked Monologues podcast listeners. Keep listening.
Thank you so much.
It is great. So I really appreciate it. I'll keep listening. And then to answer your question, if you're interested in connecting with me, you can connect with me through my podcast called Your Creative Chord. That's CHORD, like a piano chord or a guitar chord. Your Creative Chord /Get Inspired. You can join me there to get more inspiration and subscribe to my website. And you can also purchase my book.
I love that.
You can go to yourcreativechord.com /books and check it out. And I'm in the middle of a poetry series right now on the podcast, so we dive into similar topics. So I hope you'll join. I'm doing some readings from the book too. But I'd love to have more connection there with you and your audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And if you listeners love this episode of Masked Monologues and you'd like more episodes just like this, then please share it with a friend or family member, and we hope to see you next time.